Thousands of African refugees and illegal migrants fleeing war, poverty and persecution are dying while others face harrowing abuse in their attempts to reach Europe's Mediterranean coasts. Many risk their lives in this journey fraught with dangers. One of the migrants speaks about his journey after arriving in Europe.
C'est une situation catastrophique qui nous a poussé de venir. Même il y a des gens qui meurent dans la route. Beaucoup. Il y a des accidents, tout. Il y a là-bas. C'est dur maintenant.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenya, and welcome to this week's edition of Africa Today. In our show today, we are analyzing some of the reasons why African migrants put their lives in danger in desperate journeys across the Mediterranean to Europe. We shall also focus on the recent elections in Seychelles, where an opposition candidate was elected as president for the first time since 1977.
Hereby declare Mr. Wevel John Charles Ramkalawan as the elected candidate for the presidential election.
Stay tuned till the end of our show and keep your comments coming as you watch.
Dangerous journey to Europe. Thousands of refugees and migrants are dying, while many are suffering extreme human rights abuses on irregular journeys from Africa to Europe through the Mediterranean Sea. A recent report released by UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and the Mixed Migration Center, titled "On This Journey, No One Cares If You Live or Die," details are provided on how most migrants suffer in the journey to Europe. Despite the risks, many continue to take this dangerous journey, saying they have no choice.
Il y avait des femmes et puis les enfants aussi. Ils sont en train de pleurer. Bon. Nous tous, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui ont pleuré quand même, mais on n'a pas de choix, on n'a pas de soin. Bon, on est obligé de rester dans la mer comme ça. Bon, ce n'était pas facile ces jours-là. On est très fatigué.
According to the Missing Migrants Project of the International Organization of Migration, so far in 2020, more than 200 migrants have drowned, and over 280 others went missing while trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. Another 9,800 migrants were returned to Libya. This North African country has emerged as the dominant transit point for migrants hoping to get to Europe from Africa.
Libya has been in chaos since 2011 when a popular uprising and a NATO military intervention led to the ouster of longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Now, for more on this, we are joined by Mustafa Traore, an academic, political analyst, and founder of anopeneye.org. Thanks a lot, Mr. Traore, and good to have you in our show today. Now, despite being aware that they are taking a journey fraught with risks and possible death, African migrants attempt to cross the Mediterranean and enter Europe. Now, what's your take on this?
If you've got migration from Africa to the West today, it's mainly because there are some issues in the African continent. So there is misery caused by different things. And this is, I think, what we should tackle. So which means that if people are moving just because they prefer to live to some other places, this is fine. But when they are forced to leave their home land, this is where you've got a problem.
Mustafa Traore, African Affairs Analyst, thanks for that.
Most of the African countries whose citizens are escaping to Europe are rich in natural resources, including oil, gas, and minerals such as gold and uranium. However, these natural resources are being plundered by Western multinationals colluding with corrupt state officials in Africa. This looting by Western multinationals leaves many Africans poor, and for many, migration to Europe is the only option left to make it in life.
Last year, Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio accused France of continuing the colonial exploitation of Africa and causing people to migrate from the continent. Let's take a listen.
There are dozens of African countries where France is printing a currency of its own, the franc of the colonies. And with that currency, French debt is financed. If France didn't have African colonies, which it's impoverishing, it would be the 15th world economic power.
Many of these illegal migrants crossing the Mediterranean are from African countries that continue to suffer economic exploitation by former European colonial powers. Now, are these powers to blame for these crises?
The reason why Africans are going and migrating and trying to leave the continent, you've got to blame some of the European countries for what is happening. It is neocolonialism that put Africa in a certain situation of misery so that the people there have no other choice than leave the continent. So, and if you look at some of the organizations also, you've got in the African continent like ECOWAS, this is just a French organization. This is just an organization to better control some countries in West Africa.
Thanks for that, and stay tuned for more.
The 2011 US-led NATO intervention in Libya against the dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi was a complete failure. The country descended into chaos and has never seen peace since then. Before the NATO military intervention, Libya was a prime destination for migrants within Africa. The country's oil wealth propelled a strong economy and plentiful jobs. Now Libya is a dangerous transit point for illegal migrants going to Europe. A spokesman for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees explains here why Libya and other sub-Saharan African countries are preferred by human traffickers.
The routes through North and Sub-Saharan Africa are very, very complex, but typically it's where the smugglers and traffickers are able to carry out their actions with impunity. It's in places that are beset by conflict. It's in places where states often no longer have strong rule of law. They're not able to hold people, the smugglers and traffickers, accountable. And the human trafficking is just one aspect of this.
Libya is now the major North African point of transit used by illegal immigrants after a NATO military intervention that hijacked a popular revolution. Is Europe facing a crisis of its own making?
Definitely it is. It is. But I'm not going to be concerned about what France is experiencing today. I'm more looking at the African continent and how people are suffering. What this experience tells us is that Gaddafi was a better solution. When he was in power, there were no questions of terrorists in Libya. And he warned the West about what was going to happen. He was not listened to. And now you've got Africans who used to live in very good conditions in Libya before the war that was initiated by the West and by France. And now they are just used as slaves.
African migrants face a dangerous trek through the Sahara Desert and a precarious voyage across the Mediterranean. But when they arrive in Europe, most of them face a life full of hardships and abuses they never imagined. According to a report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, migrant farm workers in parts of southern Italy are enduring extreme levels of labor exploitation and coercion and inhumane working conditions. An abused immigrant worker elaborates here on his suffering.
A lot of us are living in abandoned houses where there are no toilets, no electricity, no water. Let's not talk about it. I lived in a house without electricity for 6 months. It was a shack. It was in the winter. Many people are living in these conditions.
African migrants in Europe now face human rights violations and discrimination. Now, what does this say of European countries which claim to champion for human rights?
When you had the French Revolution, and after the French Revolution, you still had slavery in the African continent, in the West Indies, and you had colonialism with forced labor. So which means this revolution they're talking about, this was for the white man and not for the dark or the black man. So this is something we've got to understand. Same thing in the United States. Okay, this was the free world, in the first half of the 20th century, but black people could not vote in some states. So in fact, when white people speak of freedom and human rights, it is for them, not for the others.
Thanks for that, Mr. Traore.
Many analysts believe African countries need to pursue growth strategies that will create good jobs and incomes for all the youth, while stopping the pillaging of the continent's resources by multinationals. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo says African nations have a responsibility to help create opportunities for their citizens at home to prevent the exodus of young Africans to Europe.
It is our responsibility to create conditions that would allow our young people to be able to live lives of dignity and fulfillment in their places of origin. That's what leadership should be focused upon. That's what our policies should be focused upon. And for me, it's obvious that we have a responsibility to our young people.
What practical steps should be taken to prevent illegal African migrants from leaving their countries for an uncertain future in Europe?
Our African understands that coming to the West is not the solution. The solution is the liberation of the African continent, fight against these big corporations exploiting the African continent and not giving back to the people in Africa. This is the solution. The leaders as well, we've got to fight against all the leaders that are puppets of the West, working for the West and not for the Africans. So this is what I think is the solution. Education through social media, informing them, supporting them in their fights, and also fighting through lobbies the governments that are not working for the Africans. Okay, because we all know everyone loves Africa, but without the Africans. And all Africans have to be aware of that. Unity among the different African states, be it North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, we have to be united and work together and fight.
African penguin numbers are dwindling, but researchers think they may have found a solution. They're trying to make a new breeding colony. A team planned to release scores of orphaned hand-reared penguin chicks at South Africa's Western Cape de Hoop Nature Reserve in the hope of saving them from extinction. Since January last year, they have deployed dummy penguins that emit the bird's distinctive call to try and entice them to de Hoop. Success so far has been hit and miss, but researcher Christina Hagen says they remain optimistic. There was once over 1 million penguins here in South Africa back in the 1920s. Now there's only around 13,000. The researchers now plan to release around 50 juvenile birds each year over several years, starting early next year, to try and establish the colony. Using decoys is a more unusual strategy. Hagen says hand-reared chicks are usually released into existing colonies. But De Hoop has good fishing waters and it was settled briefly by penguins in the mid-2000s, until they deserted it again after leopards started hunting them.
From other studies, the decoys don't even have to be super realistic. They can just be the right shape and colour and the birds respond to them into thinking they were real.
Dwindling African penguin numbers are attributed largely to depleting fish stocks and worsened by climate change. Their eggs have also been harvested for human consumption.
Opposition's victory in Seychelles elections.
An opposition candidate won the Seychelles presidential election in October, marking the first opposition victory since the Indian Ocean archipelago's independence from Britain more than 4 decades ago. Wawel Ramakalawan defeated President Dani Faure by 54.9% to 43.5%. This is how his victory was declared by the head of the Electoral Commission.
Hereby declare Mr. Wewel John Charles Ramkalawan as the elected candidate for the presidential election.
In his first comments since winning, Mr. Ramkalawan was conciliatory and emphasized that the country was the ultimate winner.
In these elections, there were no losers, there were no winners. Our country was given the opportunity to come out as the ultimate winner.
Ramkalawan, a former Anglican priest, defeated Faure after 3 decades of unsuccessful runs for the presidency of the East African nation, an Indian Ocean archipelago famed for its natural beauty and rare wildlife. Now, to discuss more on the unprecedented and historic victory of the opposition in the recent elections in Seychelles, we have contacted Julius Mbaluto, an African affairs analyst. Thanks a lot for your time, Mr. Mbaluto. Now, what triggered the opposition victory in Seychelles against a party that has been in power for 44 years?
Despite the fact that Seychelles is one country with the highest GDP in Africa, poverty still remained a very key issue, and also the gap between the rich and the poor carried on widening. And it's only a way of saying that, yes, people had enough, especially the voters, and they had to vote perhaps a system that is going to be serving them. And that also explains why they chose as their president a priest, a man who has been a preacher, talk about the values in a person and ethics. Most of the time, we have seen the society wherever we are tending to think, religious people tend to come up with better ethics. They tend to come up with compassion for the masses.
Ramakalawan's campaign was largely based on a pledge to hike the minimum wage after COVID-19 stifled the tourism-dependent economy. In an interview before the elections, Faure admitted that the first 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic were the toughest in his presidency.
Well, what I can say, the last 6 months has been the toughest 6 months of my presidency. And let me be clear here. The seat of the presidency is not an easy seat.
Seychelles relies heavily on tourism, which collapsed following the COVID-19 pandemic. Was this a factor in the victory by the country's opposition party?
Yes, COVID-19 has messed the economy of Seychelles. It just brought it almost down to its knees, because when you see the amount of people who travel in Seychelles, an estimate of about 350,000 in a year is a lot of people. And seeing, what has been happening throughout 2020, inability of people to even make just a flight, not even to go and become a tourist. It's been a nightmare. And yes, there definitely, again, I would say probably the voting was also instructed by what was going on. And again, I think people were thinking, let's elect someone who will be more capable to deal with our problem especially to rebuild the economy after the impact, from COVID-19 and beyond.
According to the World Bank, Seychelles has the highest gross domestic product, GDP per capita, in Africa, at nearly $17 billion in 2019. But inequality is significant, placing the prospect of continued shared prosperity in tighter focus. This inequality has come with the problem of drug addiction. This Indian Ocean archipelago suffers from the highest rate of heroin abuse in the world. Policymakers are now putting measures in place to tackle the growing problem.
When we did the survey in 2011 and we found out that we had around 1,200 youths using heroin, we should have acted then, okay? But we didn't. What we did, we increased the sentences. The major problem is for many years, the approach has been a punitive one.
The economy of Seychelles is still controlled by people of European descent, while locals are faced with many problems such as drug addiction and poverty. What is the reason for these inequalities?
A lot of investors, especially in the hotel industry, most of them are Europeans, and they come and they invest a lot. But their issue is to just maximize profit, minimizing, the cost. And therefore, you find a situation whereby you will always have that inequality, whereby despite Seychelles having a very wonderful, very important and wonderful economy, outlooks, you still find that we still have inequality. We still find Seychelles people talking about having that narrative of $1 a day kind of lifestyle.
A variety of ethnic groups can be found in the cultural melting pot of the Seychelles, and each has left its own mark on the country's vibrant and peaceful society.
Victoria is the most unique place in the world. Unique because of the mixed culture that we have. We are blended with Africans, Asians, Indians, so it's a mixture of everything. And you get to enjoy a lot of things.
Now, what needs to be done to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor in the Seychelles so that all can feel they are part of the country's unique culture and geographical location?
The country of Seychelles has got enough. The question is, what is the government going to do to make sure there is equality, there is justice, there is fairness, and also those who are investing, are they paying people living wage, or are they just going to make money at the expense of poor people and perpetrating poverty? We should not be talking about poverty in a country like Seychelles because it's got enough resources at its own disposal to make sure every citizen lives proudly as a Seychellian and is proud to belong to the country. And why? Because they have enough, and they have enough to live on, and they even have enough to share.
While Julius Banluto there believes that if the government in the Seychelles takes serious steps to end inequality, then poverty will be eliminated in these pristine Indian Ocean islands. Well, that brings us to the end of our show, which also focused on the increasing problem of young, desperate Africans risking their lives in a dangerous journey to Europe due to lack of opportunities in Africa. Thanks a lot for watching our show today, and we do welcome your comments on what you have seen today. On behalf of the entire African Today team, take care and goodbye.